Chicago Bears training camp is a great opportunity for players to really make a name for themselves. But any player that moves up the depth chart means that another player has to move down. And plenty of guys out there have a lot to lose at training camp.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on all of your favorite social media platforms, including the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. On the show today, we look at the Chicago Bears players with the most to lose at training camp. Yesterday, we broke down the players with the most to gain. The players who can really move themselves up, create a little role for themselves, and potentially a much brighter future in Chicago or the rest of the NFL as their careers go on. Today, we'll go the opposite direction. The players who might be in a good position as we sit today, but if they don't maintain a high level of performance at training camp, they could find themselves moving down the depth chart with some other young, hungry players behind them on the roster, and maybe even some of these guys go as far as losing their spot on the 53-man roster, but they start training camp generally in a good position where it's their job to lose or their role to lose or their playing time to lose, but they begin this stage of the process in the driver's seat, and it's up to them whether they lose that or hold on to that as they try and stave off the competition behind them. Like, for example, I think the biggest area we see this, or perhaps the most impactful area we're going to see this, is on the Chicago Bears offensive line, where Nate Davis is not in any immediate risk of losing his starting job, but he's one of the few starters in here that has a risk involved, given his track record of lack of availability, that he wasn't around enough last season, whether it was off the field issues or injuries or whatever multiple things he was dealing with. He performed below average when he was on the field and was missing in action more often than we would have liked. We go through this offseason so far, and he isn't there for all of OTAs and minicamp, and we again have questions about, is this guy going to be around when the Chicago Bears need him to? And certainly many of the reasons he hasn't been around have been outside of his control and not his fault. But regardless of the reason why, the Chicago Bears have operated in the reality where, hey, Nate Davis is not here as much as we would like or need him to be on this offensive line. And so, I don't think he's going to lose his starting job at training camp. It does feel like the more this builds up, the more he has to lose and the more risk for him personally there is. If he just isn't able to really give them a reliability in his availability, they have to prepare for the possibility that he's not there. And that's been Ryan Bates filling in as, he was originally competing at center, but now playing some right guard, kind of doing both of those spots. They also have, Ja'Tari Carter can play right guard. They signed Matt Pryor from the 49ers, who can play guard or tackle. Jake Curhan from the Seahawks can play guard or tackle. Karan Amagaji, the third-round pick, can play guard or tackle. And even Larry Borum has played guard and tackle before. The Chicago Bears have other options besides Nate Davis. He is and should be their best option at right guard. They're paying him like he should be and is their best option at right guard. He's one of the highest paid guards in football in terms of the cap hit, how much he counts against the Chicago Bears salary cap this season. Like, he's among, I think it was top 10 highest paid guards this season. They need him to be out there and to be playing. But if he's not, they have to be ready for alternatives, and they have alternatives. And so in that regard, like, if he's, for whatever reason, unable to keep going in training camp, like, at some point do the Bears say, we got to stick with who we know will be out there and reliable for us and eventually move on from Nate Davis. Like, they're not going to cut him. He's too expensive to cut. And I don't know that he's going to have a lot of trade value given how expensive he is, but like, there's a lot to lose there for him as a guy who needs to have a good training camp and a good 2024 season to extend his time in Chicago, or else this could very well easily be his last season. One other offensive lineman quick, I think among the backups, it's Larry Borom that has the most to lose there, right? We talked yesterday about Karan Amagashi being a guy who has a lot to gain as one of the backup offensive linemen who comes in a little bit late to this process, but a guy who's already guaranteed a roster spot given where they drafted him. Borom's been here a while and was a starter for a little while and has guard and tackle experience, but clearly the Bears have gone out and said, hey, we're going to add some competition. Not specifically just for Larry Borom, but like to make the offensive line depth better, to try and get the best possible backups and as a result of that, it pushes Larry Borom. And if Larry Borom can continue to play like the Bears' best backup offensive lineman or whatever category you want to put him in, then he'll be fine. But he has a lot to lose because of a lot of the names we just talked about when we were talking about Nate Davis, right? Like Matt Pryor from the 49ers has started games for them, guard and tackle. Jake Curhan from the Seattle Seahawks has started games at guard and tackle. Jatari Carter's played guard for the Bears. Karan Amagashi, coming in as a third-round rookie, played guard and tackle in college. Like, Borom is directly competing with all of those guys to be the 6th, 7th, and maybe 8th offensive lineman on the Chicago Bears. And depending on their comfort level with Borom as a guard versus Borom as a tackle, and Pryor as a guard versus Pryor as a tackle, and Amagashi as a guard versus Amagashi as a tackle, they might say, you know what? Amagashi's more of a tackle, and Jatari Carter's more of a guard, and we like them better at those spots than Larry Borom. Like, we like Carter's better as a guard than Larry Borom is as a guard, and Amagashi's better as a tackle than Borom is as a tackle. So, like, he might be more versatile than either one, but we like our options. Otherwise, I mean, I'm just sort of throwing out a hypothetical here, and that's where Borom ultimately maybe ends up on his way out if he doesn't have a strong enough training camp to hold off of this competition. It's not that he's doomed. It's not that I'm predicting he's going to miss the 53, but it's a sign that, like, hey, this guy's got a lot to lose because he could easily be your top backup offensive lineman, your 6th lineman who could play guard or tackle. That's valuable. And he's been here a while, and he knows this offensive line coach better than any of the other guys we mentioned. Like, he has the advantage here. It's not that he's about to lose his job and we're all just waiting for it to happen. But at the same time, the level of competition that he's battling with is stronger now than it has been in years past. And there's a question of whether or not he was on the team and in the lineup because they just didn't have better options, or because he was legitimately, better than players like he's competing with now. And at training camp, we're going to find that out. And we're also going to find out just how strongly the Bears feel about Nate Davis, depending on how available he is and how much he's around and how much they, placate what he needs in this stage of his career and his life and everything that he's going on with, either injury-wise or off the field, which again is largely outside of his control and not things that I'm trying to rag on him individually. Like, he's not a bad person or a bad player for these things. It's just a reality for the Chicago Bears. And at some point it becomes a business and a team that's about winning and not just about making sure that everyone is able to be the best versions of themselves or whatever that ends up being. So the offensive line, definitely a space for some competition here with some room for guys to lose. Same is true at a couple other positions with a couple of clearly established veteran starters who are great, but the guys behind them who are right now in the lead to be their backups have a lot of competition. And maybe these key rotational roles could end up being filled by somebody else, somebody brand new on the roster instead of the guys that we're used to from last season. So we'll go through a receiver and a defensive lineman that have a lot to lose, despite us feeling optimistic about what they can be, next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at Gametime, the best way to get tickets for all of your favorite live events. I use Gametime all the time to go to concerts, to go to games, to go to theater shows, comedy in my area. Like, it's on my phone. I use it all the time. It helps me figure out even what's going on in my area and discover shows that I wouldn't have even known to go to in the first place. I love it because I can see my view from my seat, so I know exactly what I'm getting, and I also know exactly what I'm paying, because they have all-in pricing, so there aren't any added fees at the end that make your tickets cost way more than you thought they would. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem our code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. The Bears don't have many starters with a lot to lose at training camp, but some key rotational players who aren't starters but will play big roles right off the bench are up for grabs. And there's a few players who come in as the incumbents that we assume, they're probably going to be the next man up. They are the favorites to be the next man up, and given that they've been here before and a lot of their competition are new players, that you would expect, the player who the coaches know who played a decent amount last season is probably going to be the player who occupies that role again. But for both of these guys, the Bears have gone out and added new players to add some competition at those spots and push them to make sure that, hey, if you're going to be our next man up in these roles, you better make sure you're on your game because we're pushing you with veterans who have been around more or people with different experience that can push you for your spot on this roster. Let's stick on offense to start with Tyler Scott, your second-year wide receiver out of Cincinnati, someone who had occasional flashes last season, but wasn't dominant by any means. But okay, there was something there where you're like, okay, maybe Tyler Scott can keep growing and become not a 1,000-yard number one receiver by any means just yet, but maybe he could become a number 3 and maybe even someday a number 2. And then, of course, you trade for Keenan Allen, you draft Rome Odunze, and Tyler Scott jumps down to 4th on your wide receiver depth chart. But after you get through more Keenan Allen and Rome Odunze, that wide receiver room is wide open. Certainly, Tyler Scott is the favorite there, given that he's only in his second year and that he was a 4th-round pick last season, and not many other players on this wide receiver depth chart have been around and have played significant roles for the Chicago Bears offense. You got Velus Jones, who's been around a year longer, but not a big offensive playmaker. Pettis has been around, but feels like more of a desperate Luke Getsy kind of player as opposed to someone who's going to make a real, push in this wide receiver room. And then they brought in DeAndre Carter and Freddie Swain, and they got some other younger players like Colin Johnston, etc., Simba Webster. But I think we can all sit here today and say, more Allen Odunze, and then probably Tyler Scott 4, and then a couple other players are trying to compete for 5 and 6. But if Tyler Scott doesn't have a very good training camp, doesn't make a lot of progress, is still, struggling whatever to pick up the Shane Waldron offense or whatever, reason it might be, he's not going to get cut. He's not going to lose his spot on the 53. But that number 4 receiver role is anyone's job. It's Scott's to lose, but it's wide open. Freddie Swain comes in and reconnects with Shane Waldron. They worked together in Seattle for a number of years. He was the number 3 receiver in this offense in Seattle. He could easily take that number 4 spot from Tyler Scott, or DeAndre Carter or Dante Pettis could find a groove in this offense. I mean, any of these guys in theory could work their way up to that number 4 spot. It's Scott's to lose, but there's a lot he can lose there. Again, not his 53-man roster spot. They're not going to cut a 4th-round pick after 2 seasons with the team, or I guess a full season and now a training camp. No, he's not going to get cut, but his role within the offense, which is not insignificant as the number 4 receiver on offense. You're going to play on offense. You're not purely a special teams guy in that role. You're going to see the field sometimes, and if, heaven forbid, there's any injury at receiver, your role is going to be that much bigger as you move up that depth chart. It's anybody's game, but it's Scott's that has a lot to lose. I think it's not too dissimilar to this defensive line, where as it stands right now, it's Montez Sweat and DeMarcus Walker as your starters. And I don't think anyone is sitting here today looking at the Chicago Bears depth chart on defense and saying, you know what, maybe Austin Booker could take over as a starter as a rookie. I don't think any of these backup defensive ends are significant pushing threats to, certainly not Montez Sweat, but maybe DeMarcus Walker as the other starter. No. If they sign Yannick Ngakoue, that pushes Walker down, but the guy's under contract. We know who the starters are, and we know who the backups are at defensive end. But you're top defensive end backup right now. The defensive line equivalent of that number 4 receiver there is Dominique Robinson as your number 3 defensive end, the first pass rusher off the bench at the defensive end spot as we stand right now is Walker, is Dominique Robinson, because he's the one who was here last season. He was a starter last season before they traded for Montez Sweat. Like, he has the experience and the familiarity. Like, yeah, Khalid Kareem was around, I guess, but like, Robinson is your number 3 pass rusher right now. But in free agency, they signed Jake Martin from the Colts, who was their number 3 pass rusher. Not dominant by any means, but a guy who saw the field a decent amount. And of course, we mentioned you drafted Austin Booker in the 5th round. You'd claimed Khalid Kareem off waivers last preseason, at the end of the preseason, before the regular season. They signed Daniel Hardy. They have a couple of undrafted rookie free agents as well. They have thrown a lot of bodies at that defensive end position. And any one of those guys could have a really strong training camp and show new defensive coordinator Eric Washington and defensive line coach Justin Smith. I always do this. I always make it Justin Smith from the San Francisco 49ers. It's Travis Smith is the defensive line coach of the Chicago Bears. And I'm going to try to quit making that mistake, but I do it a lot. Travis Smith, the defensive line coach of the Chicago Bears, impress this coaching staff and say, well, Eric Washington has no connection to Dominic Robinson. He wasn't here before. All these defensive linemen are new to your defensive coordinator who has a defensive line coach background. So any of these guys could impress him and become that new number 3 pass rusher. And Dominic Robinson could easily miss the 53-man roster and be cut altogether, not because he doesn't have enough talent or whatever, but just because other guys play better and it's a wide open spot. Like, he is the incumbent front runner here, but has a lot of room to move down, not only down the depth chart, but maybe down off of the roster altogether if he doesn't continue to show improvement and build up towards that potential that the Bears saw in him when they drafted him in the 5th round a couple of seasons ago. But for a 5th round pick, like, you don't get that long of a leash. They're not going to be that patient with you after, 3 seasons. You need to show enough to keep making the team, because they're not going to be afraid to cut him just because they drafted him in the 5th round and whatever they had invested in him. Like, they have put a lot of energy and time into Dominic Robinson, and we all want to see him get better and continue to improve. But if Jake Martin and Austin Booker and Khalid Kareem and whoever all show you they're better players, they're not just going to keep Dominic Robinson for the sake of keeping Dominic Robinson, and they could certainly choose to move on. And that's where it gives him a lot to lose when he's starting training camp seemingly towards the front of the line among all the backups at the defensive end position. And if they sign Yannick Ngakoue at some point or another defensive end, that just pushes him down even further and puts that much more pressure on him to perform and produce during these training camp practices. I think there are 2 other players on this roster that we might not immediately think of having a lot to lose or even having their roster spot in jeopardy. But given how this has played out at their positions, actually, they kind of have the same general position here. There's 2 members of this secondary that I think have more to lose than you might think. And I'm not ready to predict that they're going to lose their job or that they're going to lose their roster spot, but they do have to sort of keep an eye over their shoulder and make sure that there's not anybody breathing down their neck, because there certainly are some hungry, capable players behind them on the depth chart that could unseat 2 of the Bears' top backup safeties, who we'll talk about next on Locked On Bears. We don't really think of the Bears' safety position as being a big competition in training camp. We know Kevin Byard and Jaquan Brisker are both going to be starting at safety. There's no real question there. And we know that, like, when you look at this Bears depth chart, the top 2 backup safeties are pretty obvious at this point. In free agency, they signed Jonathan Owens from the Green Bay Packers, who started some games for them and has played quite a bit around the NFL. Not like a guaranteed starter, but, a guy who's been a top backup for teams. And then they still have Elijah Hicks, who was their top backup to Eddie Jackson last season and also started some games when Eddie Jackson was injured. And if you're putting your Bears 53-man roster prediction in pencil or pen at this stage of the process, you're writing those 2 names in with a pretty decent level of confidence. And yet, I think they both have a lot to lose at training camp for different reasons. So, first of all, for Jonathan Owens, famously married to, actually, I think they're married now, to Simone Biles, the Olympic gymnast. Yeah, they're definitely married. That's been a big part of his life and absolutely should be. And the Bears have given him permission to miss portions of training camp to go watch his wife perform at the Olympics. And I am not here to rip Jonathan Owens for that or to have some kind of sports radio gas bag take about how football should be more important and that he should put the Chicago Bears first and he can watch his wife on the Olympics on TV and he can record it and watch it later and he should be here for his teammates or whatever. No. I mean, any player should go like family first. Football can be second. That's okay. But also, like, they signed him as a free agent. They clearly want him. He's been around the NFL a little bit for a while. Like, he's no great player, but like, this is not some undrafted rookie free agent who has to prove a bunch to everybody to keep his job. Like, no. But at the same time, if he's gone, and I don't know exactly how long to expect him to be gone, other players will take his snaps at practice. And if he misses any kind of significant time, which won't be that significant, I don't want to overblow this at all. But for whatever he misses, if, a young guy like Quindell Johnson, who they brought in last season off of waivers at the end of training camp or at the end of the preseason, like if Quindell Johnson plays well and say Jonathan Owens has a mediocre to below average camp and then misses some practices and then comes back and is still mediocre to below average during the preseason games, well, the guy behind him on the chart, Quindell Johnson, has a strong camp and plays really, really well, or however you want to define it, like all of a sudden is there. Like Jonathan Owens was signed as a free agent and the Bears liked him a lot, but it was a 1-year deal, right? This was not a guaranteed a bunch of money. The Bears are really going to make sure. No, excuse me, it was a 2-year deal. I will correct myself here, but with only $1 million guaranteed, a 2-year, $4 million contract with $1 million guaranteed. Like they could cut him and save a little bit of money. They're not locked into having to have Jonathan Owens on the roster this season. They will, most likely, because he's a better player than the other guys behind him on the depth chart. But he does have something to lose here by not being around and by having some young, hungry players behind him on the depth chart. And I think Elijah Hicks does too, because I think we've maybe slightly overlooked what the Bears did do behind him on the depth chart. One of the players that they signed in free agency to essentially a veteran minimum contract, very close to it, and not one of these contracts or signings that really got a big announcement about it or kind of fanfare or a lot of attention really to it at all, was Tarvarius Moore as a backup, really third string safety, right? We're not going to do a podcast about a third string safety. You're not going to see a bunch of tweets about, Bears signed third string safety Tarvarius Moore. But Tarvarius Moore is a little bit more than your average third string safety. He's a guy who has started 13 games for the San Francisco 49ers, and that's not any run-of-the-mill defense he's started on, but started games for the 49ers. Now, he missed all of last season. I think he was on a practice. He was with a team in training camp and then went on injured reserve and then eventually released from injured reserve. He's not freshly off of this 49ers defense. But he also, he recorded an interception in the Super Bowl for the 49ers not this year, but the last time they were in. He has played big moments on a really good defense. Now, he's not a lockdown great safety. If he was really great, he wouldn't have come to the Bears on a minimum and he wouldn't be number 3 on this free safety depth chart. But that being said, he is certainly proven to be capable of more than just third string free safety. And if I'm Elijah Hicks, that's a real pressure there. There's certainly a strong potential for somebody like Tarvarius Moore as a former third-round pick to come into Bears training camp and for whatever reason, this is the right defense and it clicks for him and he practices really well. And Elijah Hicks is not guaranteed anything. This was a 7th-round pick a couple of years ago. He's been their top backup free safety for a couple of years. He has the experience and the familiarity and has the leg up for sure and is the guy that we're penciling in on the 53-man roster prediction. And no one is really strongly expecting Tarvarius Moore to be a guy who completely unseats him, but there's a real possibility there given what he's been able to do. This is not some training camp body, where it's just some guy, some undrafted free agent off the street that doesn't really stand much of a chance of making noise here. No, Tarvarius Moore has played big moments in big games on a good defense. He's got the potential there for sure. He's still only 27 years old. He could easily outperform Elijah Hicks and be your Bears backup free safety. There's quietly a backup safety competition at both spots. I think Owens, given that he got a 2-year deal with $1 million guaranteed, the Bears are fully expecting him to be good and maybe miss a few practices for Olympics, but be fine otherwise and not really cause any problems and be your top backup strong safety. although Quindell Johnson has some potential there. But I think the Moore versus Hicks free safety battle is a little bit more interesting and a little bit more open, and maybe hasn't gotten enough attention on this training camp sort of preview circuit here because of some of the other positions like defensive line and some of the backup offensive line spots that get a little bit more attention. But like Hicks versus Moore has some real potential here. Again, it'll be Brisker and Byard and Owens and Hicks most likely as your 4 safeties, but Moore and Johnson are not nothing. And if either of the safeties ahead of them on the depth chart give them any sort of a window to earn some more playing time, you might just see the Bears try that out a little bit and see what they got out of that position. Like Ryan Poles has done a good job of adding competition at a lot of these spots where guys like Larry Borum and Elijah Hicks have been incumbents who the Bears have been able to turn to and get, average-ish performances from play when they've needed them. But now Ryan Poles says, okay, like Borum, we appreciate you. And Hicks, we appreciate you. And if you keep playing well, we'll keep paying you and giving you playing time. But here's a Jake Curhan. Here's a Matt Pryor. Here's a Tarvarius Moore. Just to push you a little bit and make sure that you're better than them. And if you are, great. We'll keep rolling with you and we're happy to have you here. But if you're not, we've got other options. And you're not that valuable to us individually. But it'd be nice to have you around, and it's preferable to develop the players you've drafted in-house as opposed to going to outside free agents to build up your depth. So that's where I think this group has the most to lose. Again, yesterday we went through the players with the most to gain. I don't like to focus on the negative side of it too much, like, oh, this player's bad or this player's whatever, but like there's 2 sides to players moving up and moving down, and that's what we've dedicated the last 2 podcasts to as we look ahead to training camp, and maybe as you still stew over some of the frustration of trying to get training camp tickets and Ticketmaster being poorly functioning and them selling out within 15 minutes. Certainly, I was in those queues in the Ticketmaster line. I didn't get any. If I did, I was going to just give them away on the podcast here. I mean, maybe go to 1 or 2, but like the plan was do a giveaway for you listening to this podcast. Say, hey, I've got tickets. Let me somehow, some kind of drawing or whatever. But alas, I didn't promise it on the front end because I want to make sure I get them first, and I couldn't because Ticketmaster is such a well-run company that we all love and love dealing with. And that's why we use the Gametime app instead of the other guys, because Gametime never has those issues. That's a free plug for them. The Bears should do their training camp tickets through Gametime because their process just works that much better. Regardless, whether you got your training camp tickets or not, I really appreciate you tuning in to Locked On Bears to get your daily Chicago Bears fix. We bring you that news and analysis all the time here on the podcast. I hope you'll keep making Locked On Bears your first listen, so we're always in your ear and getting you started on the right foot. We're going to be ramping back up to 5 days a week here as soon as next week as we start to get closer to the Bears reporting to training camp. We'll keep these training camp previews rolling a little bit over the coming days, and I hope that as we get closer, that listening to the Locked On Bears podcast makes it that much easier for you to bear down.